learners, today we are going to start with another poem in your course called Geography Lesson by Zulfikar Ghose. Now Zulfikar Ghose was born on March 13th, 1935 in Sialkot, India, which is now in Pakistan. He was born before the partition, therefore we say that he was born in India, but this place is now in Pakistan. He is a Pakistani American author, has written novels, poetry and critical essays. One of his most famous poems are Geography Lesson, which you're going to do right now. Let's see the key points about the poem. In this poem, the poet talks about the earth and its physical features from different heights as seen from an airplane. So our poet is traveling on an airplane and he talks about all the physical features of the earth that are visible from the window of the airplane, and he talks about all of these physical features from different altitudes, from different heights. The poem is divided into three parts according to the altitude at which the plane is flying. So he talks about three different altitudes at which the plane is flying, and he discusses the things that are visible from the window of the airplane. He also tries to unearth the symbolic meanings behind the physical features of the planet. So he discusses the metaphorical meanings. He discusses the hidden meanings behind all of the things that are visible. He tries to find out any deeper meanings that are there to the things that are visible from the plane window. Okay, now let's jump straight into the poem. You can pause the video right here and you can read it by yourself, or you can read it with me. Geography Lesson. When the jet sprang into the sky, it was clear why the city had developed the way it had. Seeing it scaled 6 inches to the mile, there seemed an inevitability about what on ground had looked haphazard, unplanned and without style when the jet sprang into the sky. When the jet reached 10,000 feet, it was clear why the country had cities where the rivers ran and why the valleys were populated. The logic of geography, the land and water attracted man, was clearly delineated when the jet reached 10,000 feet. When the jet rose 6 miles high, it was clear the earth was round and that it had more sea than land. But it was difficult to understand that the men on the earth found causes to hate each other, to build walls across cities and to kill. From that height, it was not clear why. Now that we've read the poem, let's move on to the analysis of the poem stanza-wise. So here is stanza number 1. Let me read and explain it to you. When the jet sprang into the sky. Sprang means to fly up. So when the jet sprang or flew up into the sky, it was clear why the city had developed the way it had. It was clear to the poet why the city had developed the way it had. The poet is looking out from the window and he is looking at the city. And he says that now I understand why the city has developed the way it has. Seeing it scaled 6 inches to the mile, there seemed an inevitability. Inevitability means the condition of being unavoidable, when you cannot avoid something. So seeing it scaled 6 inches to the mile. So now poet is at a height where 6 inches equals to 1 mile. So 1 mile on the ground equals to 6 inches when he's looking out of the window. He says that he's reached this height. There seemed an inevitability about what on ground had looked haphazard, unplanned and without style when the jet sprang into the sky. So he says that it was inevitable, it was unavoidable about what on ground had looked haphazard. Everything on the ground had looked very haphazard. Haphazard means random. Haphazard means inconsistent, something which is very messy, very chaotic, something which is not organized at all. So everything on the ground looked very haphazard, looked very, very random, inconsistent. And now that I am at a height, I can see why everything is so haphazard, so unplanned and so without style when the jet sprang into the sky. So he says, now I understand that all of these things the city had developed in a very unplanned manner. Now let's discuss the poetic devices in this stanza. Before moving on to the poetic devices, let's start discussing the rhyme scheme. Now the rhyme scheme is part of the diction. Diction means the kind of words that the poet chooses to use in their poetry to make it more effective. Now, rhyme scheme is the pattern of rhyme of the words that occur at the end of each line or of the verse, right? Let's look at the words with which these lines end. So, sky rhymes with sky, it's the same word, so we can code it as AA. City rhymes with inevitability, so B. Had rhymes with haphazard, so C. And mile rhymes with style, so D. So the rhyme scheme becomes ABCD, BCDA, right? Let's also discuss the rhyme scheme of the next stanza. This is stanza number 2. Feet rhymes with feet, so AA. Country rhymes with geography, so BB. Ran rhymes with man, CC. Populated, delineated, so DD. So the rhyme scheme is ABCD, BCDA. Here's the rhyme scheme for you. Now let's move on to the next stanza, the final stanza. So this is the final stanza here. High rhymes with Y. We can code them both as AA. Round rhymes with found, BB. Land rhymes with understand and build, so C. And kill doesn't rhyme with anything. So the rhyme scheme becomes ABCD, CC, BCDA. If you notice, this rhyme scheme is different from the rhyme scheme of the other two stanzas, right? The rhyme scheme is ABCC, BCDA. Now let's start discussing the poetic devices in this stanza. Look at line number 1 and line number 8. Do you find any poetic device here? Correct. The poetic device that is used here is called repetition, because this whole line is repeated. Now, repetition is a poetic device in which a word or a phrase is used again to emphasize on any thought or any idea that the poet wants to express, right? So this poetic device right here is called repetition. Next up, we have enjambment. Enjambment is a poetic device in which a sentence is carried over to the next line of the poem without any punctuation mark at the end. If you want to know about these poetic devices in detail, I will link a video in the description box as well as on the title of this video, right? Go through the first stanza completely, pause the video right here, find out if there are any sentences that are being carried forward to the next line without any punctuation marks. I hope that you found the examples of enjambment here. Let me discuss. Look at line number 2 and line number 3. It was clear why the city had developed the way it had. You see, this sentence is being carried forward, but it is divided into two separate lines in the poem. So we say that this is an example of enjambment here. Also, now look at line number 5 and line number 6. There seemed an inevitability about what on ground had looked haphazard. There seemed an inevitability about what on ground had looked haphazard. So this sentence is again being carried forward. However, it is divided up into two separate lines. So this is an example of enjambment here. So you can find enjambment in lines 2 and 3 and lines 5 and 6. Next poetic device is alliteration. Now you know that alliteration is a poetic device which occurs when there is a repetition of a sound at the beginning of any two connected words or adjacent words. These words could be right next to each other or anywhere in the line. The sound, however, the beginning sound gets repeated. You can also find examples in which the first letter is same. However, it's not necessary that the same letter is repeated. The sound needs to be the same. Let's discuss the examples. Look at line number 1 and line number 8. When the jet sprang into the sky. So sprang into the sky, the S sound, the S sound is being repeated. The letter S is being repeated. Similarly with line number 8, sprang sky. The sound S is being repeated here. So this is an example of alliteration. Look at line number 4. Seeing it scaled 6 inches to the mile. So seeing scaled 6. This is also an example of alliteration in which the S sound is being repeated. The letter S is being repeated. Look at line number 6 now. About what on ground had looked haphazard. Had looked haphazard. So the H sound is being repeated here. So these are the examples of alliteration. You can pause the video and you can read these. Okay, now let's move on to the next stanza. Stanza number 2. When the jet reached 10,000 feet, it was clear why the country had cities where the rivers ran and why the valleys were populated. So now the poet's plane is flying higher. It is flying at the altitude of 10,000 feet. So he says that it was clear. Now it is clear to him why the country, he can see the whole country now. He says it is clear why the country had cities where the rivers ran. He can see that most of the population is concentrated. The cities are generally along the rivers. Rivers ran means where the rivers were flowing. So all of the cities were near one river or the other. And why the valleys were populated. So valley means it's a depression between two hills or mountains. So he could see that valleys had a lot of population. It is so because generally rivers flow through these valleys and people live around the river in these valleys. The logic of geography that land and water attracted man was clearly delineated when the jet reached 10,000 feet. So the poet says that the logic of geography as a discipline, as a subject, has one logic, that people tend to live around land and water, around water bodies generally, that land and water attracted man. Land means obviously everybody lives on land. Land means people try to live around land that is fertile, right? So people are attracted towards land and water, and this logic of geography was clearly delineated means depicted or shown. It became very clear to him, the geography logic, that people tend to live around water bodies and on land masses that are fertile, and this was clear to him when the jet reached 10,000 feet. Now let's move on to the poetic devices. Just like we discussed in the last stanza, line number 1, just wait a second, line number 1 and line number 8, there's a repetition here. So we say that this is an example of repetition, right? The next poetic device that we have here is enjambment. You can pause the video right here and you can find out your own examples. I am going to discuss the examples that I have found. Look at line number 2 and line number 3. It was clear why the country had cities. So the sentence is not yet complete. There is no punctuation mark used at the end of line number 2. It is the sentence is being continued. However, it's divided up into two separate lines. So that is an example of enjambment. Line number 3 and 4. It was clear why the country had cities where the rivers ran and why where the valleys were populated. Here. This is another example. Here the sentence is not being completed, but it is divided up into two different lines. Let's look at line number 5. There's a hyphen here. It denotes that the sentence is not yet completed. The logic of geography that land and water attracted man was clearly delineated. So these are also examples of enjambment. Next up we have alliteration. Let's look at line number 3. Rivers ran. So the R sound is being repeated. This is an example of alliteration. Let's look at line number 4. why the valleys. So the verse sound is being repeated. The verse, just look at this example. The letters W and V are not the same. However, the sound of the verse sound is being repeated, like I said. So these are the two examples of alliteration. Okay, now let's move on to the third stanza. When the jet rose 6 miles high. So now the poet's jet is flying quite high. It is 6 miles in the air. It was clear the earth was round. So at first he was just able to look at the city. At the second level, he was able to look at the country, and now he is talking about the earth. He says it was clear the earth was round. It was clear to him that the earth is round in shape, that it had more sea than land, obviously, because there are more water bodies on the earth than land. But it was difficult to understand that the men on the earth found causes to hate each other, to build walls across cities, and to kill. From that height, it was not clear why. So the poet says that the one thing that is very clear to me is that the earth is round and that there is more water on the earth than land. But it was difficult to understand that men means humans, the people. It was very difficult to understand that the men on the earth found causes to hate each other. It was not clear why people hated each other so much, and they found causes to kill each other, right? To build walls across each other, across the cities, and to kill. So at this height, he could see different countries, and he could see that the nations are quite literally divided. There are borders across countries. So he says that I could see these walls, but these walls are also there within the people's hearts. People hate each other, people guard themselves and hate everyone that's outside their wall, right? So walls also has a symbolic meaning here, right? So he says he's unable to understand why people killed each other in wars, why people thought that it was necessary to create these boundaries, these walls around the countries, and it is impossible for him to understand why people hated each other. So the poet here is talking about the deeper meaning of these walls, the deeper meaning between the division between the countries. He's talking about the hatred that people have for each other and the wars that take place in which we kill each other as people. Now let's move on to the poetic devices in this stanza. Moving on to the next to the poetic device called enjambment. I've already explained what enjambment means. You can pause the video right here, go through this stanza, scan it, and see if there are any sentences that go over to the next line of the poem without any punctuation marks. I will pause for you. Okay, now let's start discussing. Look at the second line. It was clear that the earth was round and that it had more sea than land. You see, this thought is carried forward to the next line. Line 2 and 3 just seem like a single sentence. However, the line changes in the poem, right? Come to the fourth line. But it was difficult to understand that the men. So understand that the men, this is the same sentence. It was difficult to understand that the men on the earth found causes to hate each other. So here also, this is also an example of enjambment, because the thought is being carried forward, the sentence is being carried forward without any punctuation mark. There is no comma, no full stop at the end of line number 4 and line number 5 as well, right? So these are the examples of enjambment. Lines 2 and 3, lines 4, 5 and 6. Okay. So there are no other poetic devices in this stanza. Moving on to the conclusion. So these are some other literary aspects about this poem which we need to discuss. So first we have the form. There are 3 stanzas of 8 lines each. The poem is divided into 3 stanzas with 8 lines each. Let's discuss the theme. The theme is nature and human intervention. The poet very clearly describes what the earth looks like. He says that there are valleys, that there are rivers. However, he also focuses on the overpopulation in the valleys. He also focuses on the haphazard ways in which the cities have grown. He focuses on the kind of walls, the kind of boundaries that we have built across nations between two different countries. So he talks about nature and how humans have intervened means to come in between of something. We have interrupted the natural flow of nature, we have interrupted the way nature works, and we have grown in a haphazard, in a completely chaotic manner. We have disturbed the nature. This is one of the main themes that have come up throughout the poem. Towards the end, the poet also talks about how we have overtaken the nature, and we have also been spreading hatred across the world, right? Let's come to symbolism. Like I told you while I was explaining, walls are the symbol of national boundaries, literally, obviously, because we have built boundaries across along the boundaries of our nations, and hatred among people. Walls also signify the hatred, the bad feelings that we have for each other, which create wars, which create problems between different nations, between the people, and which creates those boundaries, those mental boundaries in people's minds. Now let's discuss the tone. The tone is the poet's attitude towards the subject about which he or she is writing. So tone here is thoughtful, is critical. Thoughtful means the poet is thinking very deeply about the physical features of the earth and what they signify about the human race, about how we live, about how we are, about what we are doing on this planet. The tone is also critical. He's critiquing, he's mentioning all of the negative and all of the positive things about how we as a civilization live on this planet and how we have impacted the nature. So that's it. Thank you.